In this video, we are going to be focusing on the 20th century response to classical liberalism. So the last 4 videos have served to help us better understand some of the competing ideologies and ways of thinking that emerged as a response to classical liberal thought. As a case study, we're now going to be zeroing in on what was happening in America in the 20th century and how did they respond to some of these competing ideologies and changes. There was a great social and economic upheaval happening in America, something that caused a lot of change, specifically with the economics of the country, was the Great Depression. The next 3 videos are centered around understanding how American society helped integrate some of the more collectivist principles into its running of the country. The 1920s were a period of massive upheaval in America. The country was experiencing a lot of change and still figuring itself out in its identity. The Great Depression that happened in 1929 became a catalyst for some of these changes. The Great Depression was in fact a worldwide phenomenon, but it began in America with the crashing of the stock market, what's now known as Black Tuesday. This was the longest and deepest depression of the 20th century, and in fact, we use it to help us understand 2 things. The first being the interdependence of economy that exists on the global level, and the second, that the system of laissez-faire simply cannot be sustainable in the long run. The Industrial Revolution modernized the way that we think of consumer spending. And during the 1920s, mass production and consumer spending reached an all-time height. There was a lot of wealth that was seemingly being generated. And as a result of consumerism, people were buying much more than what they really could afford. And it seemed like the economy was doing quite well. People created installment plans to help them buy things that they weren't able to afford at that moment. This became a very popular technique, something called buying on time, which means paying for your purchases on credit. Credit was used to purchase stocks as well, and the stock market, because of this, became very rife with speculation. The 1920s ushered in a time of rapid expansion of the stock market. There was exorbitant consumer spending, and by August of 1929, that reached its peak. In fact, by that time, production has already started to decline, and unemployment had already risen, leaving the value of stocks higher than the real value of goods and services being produced. This overinflation of the value of fake money or stocks eventually caused a crash that resulted in what we now know as the Great Depression. Needless to say, people were in a panic. People who invested in these stocks and invested and had their money saved in banks were in a panic to do things called bank runs, which was withdrawing money from the bank right away. People would do this by the thousands, and banks inevitably suffered and failed because of this. What happened was factories began to close, causing even more unemployment, and this unemployment in turn caused more factories to close, since people who are unemployed cannot contribute to the economic wealth of a nation. All in all, The consequences were devastating. Cities around the entire world were hit hard because so many countries had deals with America. Construction was virtually halted in many countries. Farming communities suffered and prices fell by 60%. Unemployment in America rose to 23% and in some countries as high as 33%. What was happening in leadership at the time? Well, the President of America was a man named Herbert Hoover, who served his term from 1929 to 1933. Now, Herbert Hoover was a conservatist who believed in the value of laissez-faire economics and believed in as little government intervention in the running of the country as possible. In fact, some say that he allowed the Great Depression to get as bad as it did because of his approach to economic recovery. President Hoover believed in the philosophy of rugged individualism. He believed that the citizens of America could and should succeed on their own and take care of themselves and their families instead of relying on government support. Perhaps what President Hoover didn't understand was that it was already too late and people were already crashing, as was the entire economy of the country. This deep and expansive crisis could not be solved by the principles of laissez-faire economics. In fact, the Great Depression became a sign that this approach was not sustainable for a country all of the time. And sometimes government intervention to help balance out the scales was simply necessary. The economic model of America required change. Conservative presidents like Herbert Hoover and others' laissez-faire approach in times of economic crisis only made the situation worse. Therefore, the shift away from laissez-faire economics to a more interventionist model, known as the mixed market economy, is what the Great Depression helped to bring about. The mixed market economy is something we're going to be unpacking more in our following video.